How's he going to make it free? Huh? How's that going to work exactly? Does he understand economics? I'll tell you, let's talk to a man who does understand economics, Liam Halligan, economist and broadcaster. Liam, very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. Good to be with you.
Nice to see you. I need you on here to counter the madness of Miliband. I mean, he's doing the rounds this morning, talking to people, talking absolute cobblers. He's not coming on our show for some reason, but he's been saying things like a 76% tax on energy companies isn't going to make them necessarily put the prices up. There he is talking about providing houses with literally no bills at all, even though you've got a heat pump and you've got solar panels. I mean, I don't know how he's managing to conjure all of this incredible free money out of nowhere.
I think the debate on net zero is shifting really, really quickly, Mike. The so-called Overton window of what polite society allows you to say about it has been transformed just in the last 6 to 8 weeks, I'd say. Trade unions are now being a lot more vociferous about the extent to which net zero is destroying our energy complex, making energy prices very expensive. We're seeing major pieces of industrial infrastructure fall by the wayside, not least our blast furnaces. And I think at the same time, you're getting a sense that the Tories now are saying that net zero 2050, those targets are simply impossible, even though they were set by the Tories. So I think the debate is changing here, and you have to wonder how long Ed Miliband can actually last in the Labour movement, because its net zero policies are seriously annoying, not just trade unionists, given their impact on industrial Britain. They're also annoying voters across the Red Wall. And I think we're going to see quite a lot of pushback on net zero in these local council elections as more and more Red Wall voters abandon the Labour Party on this issue.
Well, because it is literally pie in the sky, and the closer that it gets to kind of, any kind of definitive policy, the further away it seems from reality.
I think that's true, and Ed Miliband has for many years had this mantra that renewable energy is cheap energy. Well, this country's lowered its carbon emissions by a higher percentage than any other major economy in the world in the last 25 to 30 years. We have a very high share of renewables in our electricity mix, 40 to 50% on some days, and yet we have the most expensive electricity for firms and households across the developed world. Rachel Reeves has consistently said there is no trade-off between growth and net zero. There damn well is when you're trying to keep British manufacturing going. So I think the rubber is now hitting the road when it comes to net zero. This is really been, Labour's had this big split across its politics for many years, more sort of well-heeled, trendy, urban voters who like net zero because it doesn't really impact them and it's a way for them to virtue signal, and much more traditional Red Wall voters who really don't like it. I mean, I think Nigel Farage had it right when he said net zero is the new Brexit. I think at some stage, unless the political and media class really winds its neck in here, I think at some stage the likes of Reform are going to start calling for a referendum on net zero unless we have a major change in our policy.
Yes, I think that's right, because more and more, as you watch the Labour government kind of self-destruct, because that seems to be what they've been doing for the last 9 to 10 months, the economy's in the worst state that it's ever been in. It doesn't show any signs of improving. The IMF has just downgraded Britain and said you can't blame Donald Trump. I could go on. We'll come back to the economics of it. But yesterday I thought when Keir Starmer said, I think the rest of the country would expect me to behave in this way effectively, which meant that he wasn't going to apologise to Rosie Duffield over the trans business. I think they're deluding themselves that they've got a lot of support because they only talk to their own supporters.
I think that's true. We all remember, don't we, that Labour got 33% of the vote on a 60% turnout, which means they got 20% of the vote. So 4 out in 5 of the electorate didn't actually vote for this Labour government, even though they've got a big majority. So their support is wide, but very, very shallow and really quite brittle. And I think we are going to see some sense of that lack of well-grounded support. This feels very different to Blair in 97, Mike. You and I were around at that time. Back in 97, you had a lot of the public that were willing for quite a long time to give Blair the benefit of the doubt. And of course, his 170-odd seat majority was built on a much, much higher share of the vote. It was 43% of a much higher turnout. And also, I think his front bench was a lot less ideological than Starmer's front bench. On Starmer's front bench, you've got no one who has any business experience at all. Pretty much all of them have only ever worked in the public sector or the sort of part of the private sector that works constantly with the public sector. And I think there's a sense that they don't really know what they're doing on the economy.
Yeah.
You now have a situation where the British government, figures came out yesterday, borrowed £20 billion more in the last fiscal year than it did the year before. We borrowed £17 billion in March alone. That's a huge amount of money. If you put a penny on income tax, Mike, for a whole year, that raises £7 billion.
Wow.
So if you put 2p on income tax, that's £14 billion. Well, we borrowed more in a single month in March than you would raise for a whole year of tuppence on income tax. These are enormous amounts of money that we're borrowing. And I do think there's a sense that Rachel Reeves hasn't got the grit to rein in the scale and size of a now bloated state. The big pay awards she gave to the public sector immediately, pretty much on coming into office, are now taking their toll on the national accounts. And I don't like to cause alarm here, but a lot of the money the government is borrowing each month is actually spending on interest on our existing debt.
Yeah.
So I do feel we have to get hold of our public finances, and yet politicians still don't really want to talk about it. They think they can keep borrowing and spending till the cows come home, and they can't. In the end, financial markets will say no. We're not going to lend you any more money unless we charge you much, much, much more.
And then they never get
across the economy.
Right, and then they never get out of that spiral of debt, do they? And that is what I was referring to this yesterday. We were talking about it on the show when the figures came out. That if you're borrowing money to pay off interest in no domestic scenario in your own home, would that end well? Would it? I mean, there's just no way.
The only way you can get out of a situation like that, Mike, is massive inflation. In which case, the value of the debt is inflated away. But of course, that's enormously painful, and you get stagnation, all kinds of political aggro when you get really high inflation. The only other way you can get yourself out of a fiscal hole is to grow your way out of that hole. But Labour seems to be in some kind of political and intellectual and ideological doom loop. They see the public finances going wrong and they think, oh no, there's a black hole in the public finances. We need to raise tax rates in order to get in more tax revenue. But we're seeing that doesn't work. When you raise corporation tax, as we have, you get very little extra revenue, and in many cases you get less. When you try and put VAT on private education, it's not as if you raise lots of money. It just means that lots of parents can't afford private education.
Exactly.
So you lose.
And also, they're not actually, all of the public sector cuts that they're promising to make haven't really been made yet. They say they're coming, but they're not seeing a benefit from that. And generally speaking, it's impossible to cut public spending much because things happen, like the Ukraine war.
Well, it's not that we don't really have cuts in public spending, Mike. The welfare savings that we're hearing so much about, $5 billion a year by 2027, 2028, for all that political pain. It doesn't mean we're going to be spending, welfare spending is going to go down by $5 billion from where it is. It means it's going to go up by, $25 billion over the next 3 or 4 years rather than by $30 billion.
Right.
So it's slowdowns in the still fast rate of increase in public spending. And that's where we are. And we seem to have both a political and media class these days that doesn't understand that in the end, if you're managing a country, you've got to make the numbers add up at some point. And we seem averse to wanting to make the numbers add up.
Yeah.
Of course, it's difficult, but the alternative is that you end up with a major systemic crisis that causes even more pain and just increases the sort of general cynicism of the electorate now towards the people who are supposed to be in charge.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, where we are. Very well put. Liam, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Liam Halligan, economist and broadcaster there with the truth. The whole truth and nothing but the truth, which is what you get here. Not the sort of lefty, watered-down nonsense you get everywhere else, where people tell you, oh, but don't worry, there's jam tomorrow. There's things coming through down the pipeline. It's all going to be great. Well, it isn't all going to be great.